This is Dragon's Dogma 2, and this is you. Oh, looks like you died. You probably shouldn't be doing that. Fortunately, by watching these vocation guides, you will never ever die again. Ever. Results may vary, terms and conditions apply. Well met, Arisen. I'm known as Thief of Crystals and... Do you mind? I'm Thief of Crystals and I have no idea what my cloak is doing. That's very distracting. Much better. Some of you might remember me as the funny guide man. I covered every vocation for the first game, and now I'm back to do that again, but double. Now enough chit chat, let's kick it into high gear. First vocation out of the gate is the Fighter. While it is true that this serves as the most defensive vocation in the game, Fighter is something of an all-rounder between attack and defense. Lacking range or magical damage without an enchanted weapon, you double down on close-range combat, employing various techniques to get you right into the face of danger so you can respond by protecting yourself and in the process your party as a whole as you proceed to tip the scales. The Fighter's highest damage tends to come from defensive skills, which means it naturally has less of a focus on active offense, and your shield alone isn't the be-all end-all of protection, especially given how limited stamina can be. But if you learn to carefully balance that stamina, you can effectively turn a great number of attacks against your enemies, often staggering or outright killing them in the process. First, we'll cover the basics. Your light attacks come in the form of a basic string of slashes. These are snappy and do a decent whack of damage, good filler for when you're conserving stamina. If you use one while sprinting, you'll perform a running sweep, handy for getting right into the thick of it. Your heavy attack is a forward stab with a bit of wind up to it. Don't sleep on this one because the range is actually shockingly good. You should get used to using this whenever you stagger an enemy, indicated by a shockwave with larger monsters collapsing outright. I say this because when used after a stagger it becomes an extra powerful finishing move, a coup de grace so to speak. Yeah, I know Italian. Your aerial light attack is a simple swing, not much to write home about, but it's there if you need it. Due to how your light attacks string together on the ground, you're basically always better off using those when you can. Your aerial heavy attack, however, is a diving stab that can be quite powerful, equally so for attacking smaller enemies or landing on larger ones. Use it when you want to be all cinematic. I'm not gonna judge, I'm also an extra bitch. Another thing you can do when staggering smaller enemies is grab them, so you can potentially just toss them into the brine or add another enemy. If you do this while in the air, specifically falling towards them, you'll pin them to the ground, holding them steady for pawns to attack. Pinned enemies take a good deal more damage and can be hit with your heavy attack for a free finisher, so watch out for this. Now for blocking. As a fighter, your vocation action comes in the form of lifting your shield, which you can do on the ground or in the air. Basic as this sounds, blocking damage is very much a godsend. Get used to going into battle with your shield raised if you want to mitigate damage, and take the chance to strike back immediately after defending. It's important to remember that blocking isn't foolproof. It only protects you from the front. While you'll typically follow the nearest enemy while blocking, if you need to change which direction you're facing on a dime, you can do so by tapping B, or circle, or whatever your equivalent to those is. That said, here's where we get into the core skills you can unlock, also known as passives. The first of these is True Deflect, which allows you to perform what is generally known as a perfect block. As the name implies, this entails blocking right as the attack is about to land. Doing so consumes no stamina and strikes back at the attacker, typically staggering smaller enemies. In a similar vein, Enchanted Counter makes it so that if you block hits while your weapon is enchanted, attackers are promptly countered with the corresponding element. Important note here is that this applies to all blocks, not just perfect ones, turning your standard means of defense into a viable offense too. Next is Tusk Toss, performed by holding light attack and releasing. Doing so performs a vertical slash that can launch smaller enemies, applying a decent kick of damage and stagger too. It can be helpful to work this into strings of light attacks, and much like the original game, this pairs well with skills like Burst Strike, which we'll cover momentarily. Steel Foundation allows you to pull some Captain America shit, as you can raise your shield while falling from a height to reduce damage and recover faster. Honestly, this is just neat. Very cool flavor for the vocation and can potentially be something of a lifesaver because, trust me, there's going to be no end of falling off of shit in this game. In regards to party synergy, I'm just going to say here and now that especially in the early stages, having a mage pawn to heal you is borderline mandatory if you aren't playing one yourself. And remember, that's mage, not sorcerer. Sorcerer's a badass, but they're too busy standing in their ley lines to worry about your sandbagging ass. Along with that, given fighter has no means of engaging at long range, I strongly recommend an archer pawn. Makes dealing with flying enemies in particular a lot less painful. And to fill the last slot of your party, I recommend some kind of damage dealer. I found Thief to be a great choice for this. Yes, I have a bias, but I imagine you can swap this out for Sorcerer or Warrior depending on your preference. Next, let's take a look at the skills proper. If you're new here, I typically just refer to skills as their fully upgraded versions. Keeps things simple for everyone. First up, Burst Strike Returns. Now, while many players will recognize this one, for those of us who don't, this serves as the quintessential gap closer. You ever play Devil May Cry? It's Stinger. It's that. Get used to me making comparisons to Devil May Cry. I strongly doubt this will be the last one. Here in Dragon's Dogma 2, the attack remains a swift dashing thrust that sends you rushing towards an enemy to deliver a strike that can be good for interrupting smaller targets. It's your given choice for diving into the action, but try to be careful when you do so. Given that combat in general is slower and more methodical here, this skill is no exception. So due to recovery frames, you're left vulnerable for a brief window after you use it. This is more of a concern when facing larger enemies who don't get slapped around as easily. If you're an absolute gamer, you can also use it to escape danger, but this isn't always going to fly. Solid bread and butter skill. Not quite as amped as it was in the original, but absolutely remains very reliable. Cloudo Slash makes you go soaring into the air to deliver an airborne strike. It can be quite effective for bonking a bigger enemy on their noggin, but this skill is basically built to serve one very specific purpose, to send one noble message across the entire kingdom. Fuck harpies! And as the worst enemy type in this game, yeah, no dude, I completely understand if you want to devote an entire skill slot just to target them. It's more than a bit committal, but honestly, regardless of anything else, it just looks really cool. What, are you gonna be some kinda not cool person? Well, that's impossible because you're watching this video. Don't forget to subscribe, I have a Patreon. Shield Pummel is a fitting name for this next skill because, I mean, look at it. Go dung. Not only does this skill allow you to deal strike damage rather than slashing, it's really good for staggering smaller enemies, capable of sending them flying outright, and honestly, it's very funny when it happens. And if it's funny, it gets my money. One will naturally want to combine this with your heavy attack finisher after flinging enemies around to capitalize on damage. I personally find this one pretty consistently reliable, no harm in bringing it along. Shield Drum, much like in the first game, is your given taunt, drawing aggro from nearby enemies large and small, and is best paired with the Provocation augment, but is also kind of invalidated by that augment. I never felt like I had any real need for this, and I'd far sooner recommend using a skill slot for something else. The purpose of Full Moon Slash is threefold. Primarily, it's Primarily, it's an effective means of dealing with multiple targets at once, and you should definitely fall back on this when surrounded. But it's also quite good at staggering enemies and can deal some pretty good damage. Hell, because of the momentum on it, it's not half bad as a gap closer either. Fairly high speed means it doesn't pose too much of a risk if you just want to throw it out and see what happens. Also a good choice for targeting weak points after knocking down a large enemy. So Launchboard is back, and in my opinion, as a skill for the Arisen specifically, it's gotten a bit of a glow up in this game. The reason I say that isn't because the skill has changed, it's effectively the same. But I consider pawns to be a fair bit more effective than they once were, and since the Arisen isn't permitted to be as much of a demon this time around, the gap in power has closed considerably. Anyway, Launchboard has you hunker down in preparation, and if you have enough gym badges, your pawn will hurry over to be launched from your shield into the air. This works vice versa when equipped to a fighter pawn, and either way, it's best used to reach elevated weak spots or flying monsters such as dragons or griffins. It can also be used as a really jammy way of avoiding attacks and following up with your own aerial counterattack, so bear that one in mind. But yeah, this is damn effective. I just kind of flew my pawn up at this dude and watched I go completely feral, like it was over. That griffin was onion rings. Gutting Skewer is a sort of weird combination of Dire Gouge and Soul Skewer from the first game. I don't like it. That's it, guide over. The skill kicks off with a downward stab that can be initiated from the ground, in the air, or while grappling a large enemy. Upon striking an enemy, you can repeatedly tap the assigned skill button to repeatedly stab the target like a madman for steady, continuous damage. Although I found myself using this a lot, I can't say I found it especially effective. It worked just fine, but I never felt like having it was a particularly huge boon for me. But that could just be me missing Dire Gouge. I think about it every day. So primarily, Flawless Guard is your "Oh, I'm in trouble" button. You can use it to break out of flinching, and it's your given means of escape from danger. But I also found this good for pivoting around smaller enemies to flank them in an instant, or quickly reposition myself to avoid harm. Genuinely a good bit of utility here. I recommend it if you're aiming for a quick evasive dash. Speaking of evasive, Hindsight Sweep is an evasive backstep that follows up with an immediate counterattack. However, when performed right before an attack connects, you'll go in for a stronger counter dealing greater damage, with successful timing indicated by a flash. Given that this can't be cancelled, it is fairly committal, so it's best used strategically rather than just throwing it out. Alright, I'm gonna keep it real with you. Perfect blocking is cool, but it's not as punchy as it used to be. Vengeful Slash, on the other hand, is generally a superior option as a counterattack if you have the stamina for it. This skill has you enter a guarded stance, and upon being attacked you'll proceed to gently correct the offender's mistake. The counterattack you answer with sends you forward with a wide horizontal swing that piles on the damage and deals out a hefty whack of knockdown power. Quite honestly, this is probably the fighter's standout skill when it comes to this game, or at least one of them. It doesn't work for everything, but a good number of attacks you can just no-sell and get considerable damage and knockdown for your trouble. This is especially effective against enemies that are distinctly omgi, such as minotaurs and ogres. It basically turns fighting them into a complete joke, but given it's also highly useful across the entire game, I consider this skill borderline mandatory, especially if you want to double down on the Vocation's defensive nature. Alright, Divine Defense. So here's why this skill is dog shit and shouldn't use it. While the benefit is that this will block almost any attack from any direction, it leaves you incapable of doing anything else for the duration. And blocked attacks will drain your stamina faster than fighting games drain my self-esteem. Real talk, Tekken slaps, but regular blocking is just kind of a better alternative. You still don't lose health for doing so, it drains far less stamina, you have the ability to immediately counterattack, and you shouldn't typically be getting attacked from all sides at once in the first place, and if you are, maybe stop doing that. Finally, we have the secret skill for fighter, Riotous Fury. For those of you familiar with the first game, Riotous Fury is effectively Dragon's Maw Plus, kind of. It follows the same motions to begin with, but then turns into a straight up DMC combo, because while your enemies were out partying, you were studying the blade. Unlike Dragon's Maw before it, this isn't great for crowd control, but it deals some wicked damage as you go absolutely sicko mode on a single target. However, it does do an enormous number on your stamina, so be ready to commit. Note that this skill only plays out if the initial strike connects with a target. Otherwise, if you whiff that first hit, there is no follow-up, but the whiff version still takes your stamina in the divorce, just like Jessica did. Also, be very careful using this since you can be knocked out of it by anything that would stagger you normally, so most attacks. Let's round things off with the augments. Metal augments your base defense, which is to say it boosts your base physical defense by 30% and then adds an additional value of 45 if the numbers are to be believed. And it's still early days, so they aren't. But this seems to be the general consensus, so if this turns out to be inaccurate, blame yourselves. I never trust the numbers. I don't trust anyone. Provocation boosts the likelihood of you being targeted by enemies by a whopping 100%, which is helpful if you're aiming to be the resident tank, you attention seeker. Thu? Is that right? Weird word, don't like it. Anyway, this allows you to carry 10 kilograms of extra weight. Handy if you haven't been eating your beetles. Have you been eating your beetles? Dominion lets you pick up and pin down enemies for a longer duration. How much longer? Dunno, I couldn't find specifics, and I'm not gonna time that shit. I'm just making a guide, I draw the line at needing to count. Diligence speeds up your recovery when you get knocked down and when you're crawling by about 30%. And since none of my pawns like to be particularly expedient about helping my ass up, yeah, I can't blame someone wanting to opt for this one. Help me free! All in all, Fighter is a vocation that can handle offense, but should probably be doubling down on defense in a majority of situations. At least until the player is confident enough to comfortably weave between the two without burning away stamina completely. Despite the lack of range, you do have the tools to engage most enemies. A good fighter is versatile with what they have. While you aren't always going to be the heaviest hitter, patient players will be especially difficult to kill with careful use of perfect blocking and counterattacks. That about wraps up this fighter guide, but stay tuned. Like I said, I'm covering every vocation in this game, and up next is Thief. Hey, that's me! Thank you so much for watching. If you liked the video, be sure to subscribe, drop a like, and let me know your thoughts in the comments. You can join my Discord for updates and to hang out with the lovely members of the Thieves Guild. I can also be followed on Twitter, and if you'd like to support the channel, you can do so on Patreon, or simply donate directly via PayPal. Links can be found in the description below. Have a great day. I'll catch you next time.